By the time the last quiet word was spoken, not a single person in the grand hall dared to meet her gaze. But when the service began, they had all looked at Ilara with pity. They saw the grieving widow, the woman left behind, a fragile figure swathed in black, standing beside a man who was the picture of sorrow. They saw a tragedy. They had no idea they were witnessing a reckoning. 12 years of lies were about to burn, and the smoke would choke everyone who had ever thought her small. The first lie had been the marriage itself. The last lie was this funeral. And in between, a universe of deceit she was about to bring crashing down. Her husband, Marcus, squeezed her hand, a gesture of shared grief for the world to see. She felt nothing but the cold, hard weight of the key in her pocket, the key to everything. The funeral was for a woman named Sarah Jenkins. A colleague, Marcus had said. A terrible, sudden illness. He had wept. Real tears she now understood were for himself. Ilara stood in the front pew, a study in quiet composure. Her black dress was simple, elegant, a stark contrast to the ostentatious grief pouring from her husband. He dabbed at his eyes with a silk handkerchief, his shoulders shaking with performative sobs. Beside him, his mother, Eleanor, radiated a chillingly similar sorrow, her hand resting on his arm in a display of maternal support. They were a perfect portrait of a grieving family, a perfect, beautiful lie. Ilara's own face was a mask of placid neutrality. Inside, a storm of ice and fire raged. The pitying glances from friends and distant relatives felt like tiny needles on her skin. They saw her as the supportive wife, standing by her husband as he mourned a coworker. Poor Ilara, always so dutiful, always in the background. They had no concept of the truth. They couldn't possibly imagine that the woman in the polished oak casket was not just Marcus's colleague. She was his other wife, his secret wife of 12 years. The discovery had not been a single, dramatic moment. It had been a slow, agonizing unraveling. It started with a misplaced credit card statement 3 months ago, a charge for a jewelry store she'd never been to, a delicate diamond necklace. When she'd asked, Marcus had laughed it off. A surprise for their upcoming anniversary, he'd claimed, feigning annoyance that she'd ruined it. He was always so smooth, so plausible. For 20 years, she had believed him. She had built her life on the foundation of his words, never thinking to check the solidity of the ground beneath her feet. But that small lie, so easily told, had planted a seed of doubt. It was a tiny, cold thing in the pit of her stomach. It grew quietly, insistently. She started noticing other things. The late nights at the office that had become more frequent. The hushed phone calls he'd take in the other room, his voice dropping to a murmur. The weekends he was away on business trips, returning exhausted and distant. She had always accepted his explanations. He was working hard for them, for their future. He was the CEO of his family's successful manufacturing company, a legacy built by his father, Harold. The pressure was immense. She had tried to be an understanding wife, a supportive partner. She had made his life easy, comfortable. She had smoothed over his absences with excuses to their friends, managed their home, and hosted his business dinners with a smile. She had been the perfect, invisible partner. The seed of doubt grew into a thorny vine, wrapping itself around her heart. She hired a private investigator. Her best friend, Chloe, had insisted. Chloe, with her sharp eyes and even sharper tongue, had never fully trusted Marcus. "He's too polished, Ilara," she'd said a dozen times over the years. "Men that shiny are usually reflecting someone else's light." Ilara had always defended him, loyal to a fault. But this time, holding the credit card statement, his lie felt different. It felt thin, brittle. The investigator's first report was a single grainy photograph. Marcus, laughing, his arm draped around another woman. They were standing in front of a charming suburban house, a picket fence, a rosebush in full bloom. It was a picture of domestic bliss. In the photo, the woman was wearing the diamond necklace. The sight of it stole the air from Ilara's lungs. It was not the betrayal that hurt the most in that first moment. It was the cliché, the sheer, unoriginal, insulting banality of it all. The reports that followed were like chapters in a horror story, each one worse than the last. The woman was Sarah Jenkins. She was 42. They had 2 children together, a boy, 10, and a girl, 7. They had been together for 12 years. He had married her in a small ceremony in another state, a fact the investigator confirmed with a copy of a marriage license. He had 2 lives, 2 wives, 2 families. He had been living a lie of such breathtaking scope and audacity that Ilara could barely comprehend it. The investigator, a quiet man with sad eyes named Mr. Franklin, delivered the final report in person. He slid a thin file across the coffee table in Ilara's living room. The room she had decorated. The room where she had hosted Marcus's family for holidays, where she had waited up for him on countless nights. Mr. Franklin's voice was gentle. "There's more, Mrs. Thompson. The other family? They don't know about you. At all. As far as they and their entire community are concerned. He is Marcus Jenkins, a regional sales manager for a different company. He had a different name, a different job, a completely separate identity. But the worst was yet to come. Sarah Jenkins, the investigator explained, had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of cancer 6 months prior. Her decline had been rapid. She had passed away 3 days ago. The funeral was today. Ilara had stared at the file, at the photo of this other woman, this stranger who had shared her husband, and felt a wave of nausea. The man she had loved for 2 decades was a monster, a sociopath hiding in plain sight. Grief was a strange, multifaceted thing. She grieved for the life she thought she had. She grieved for the woman she had been, the trusting, naive girl who believed in fairy tales. She even grieved for Sarah, a woman she had never met, a woman who had also been deceived, who had died believing her husband was a simple sales manager named Marcus Jenkins. And she grieved for those 2 children, who had just lost their mother and were about to lose the father they thought they knew. But beneath the grief, something else was stirring. A cold, hard anger. An anger so pure and so potent, it burned away the tears. It clarified her thoughts, sharpened her focus. The humiliation, the years of being taken for a fool, of being the convenient, quiet wife while he lived another life. It all coalesced into a single point of crystalline resolve. He would not get away with it. He and his mother, who Ilara now suspected must have known, would not be allowed to stand here, performing their false sorrow, and then simply walk away to inherit the world. Now, standing in the hushed solemnity of the funeral hall, she felt a strange calm. The organ music swelled, a mournful dirge that seemed to mock the vibrant, furious life now coursing through her veins. Marcus shifted beside her, his hand still on hers. She wanted to snatch her hand away, to scream, to expose him right there in front of everyone. But that was not the plan. Her revenge would not be a messy, emotional outburst. It would be cold. It would be precise. It would be total. She thought back to Harold, Marcus's father. A gruff, quiet man with a brilliant mind and a deep sense of integrity. He had been the architect of the family empire, Thompson Manufacturing. Unlike his flamboyant wife and arrogant son, Harold had been grounded, kind. He had seen something in Ilara from the very beginning. While Eleanor dismissed her as a simple girl from a modest background, Harold had engaged her in conversations about books, politics, and even the business. "You have a good head on your shoulders, Ilara," he'd told her one evening, years ago, as they sat on the porch of his lake house. "You see the whole board, not just the next move. Marcus, he only sees the prize. He doesn't care how he gets it." At the time, she had thought it was a father's gentle critique of his son's ambition. Now, she understood it was a warning. Harold had passed away 2 years ago. His death had been a blow to the company and a deep personal loss for Ilara. She had spent countless hours by his bedside in his final months, reading to him, talking with him, while Marcus was often conspicuously absent, away on one of his business trips. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that Harold had given her a small, locked metal box. "This is for you, my dear," he had whispered, his voice weak. "Not for Marcus. For you. There is a key. I've put it somewhere safe for you. You'll know when it's time to use it. Trust your instincts. They are better than you think." He had made her promise not to open it until she felt it was absolutely necessary. He had looked at her with such intensity, such sadness in his eyes. "Protect the legacy," he'd said. "Protect yourself." She hadn't understood then. She had thought it was a sentimental gesture, perhaps some old family photos or letters. The box had sat in the back of her closet, forgotten, until the day Mr. Franklin's report had landed on her coffee table. That night, her mind racing, she had remembered Harold's words. "Trust your instincts." She had found the key exactly where he said it would be, tucked inside the cover of her favorite book, a worn copy of Pride and Prejudice he had given her on her first anniversary with Marcus. The irony was not lost on her. Her hands had trembled as she unlocked the small metal box. Inside, there was no sentiment. There was ammunition. There was a thick sheaf of papers. The first was a legally binding document. It was Harold's true last will and testament, notarized and signed just 1 month before his death. It was completely different from the will Marcus and his mother had produced after his death, the one that had made Marcus the sole heir and CEO. This will, the real will, was a bombshell. It stated in clear, unequivocal terms that Harold was leaving his entire controlling stake in Thompson Manufacturing, 51% of the company, not to his son, but to his daughter-in-law, Ilara Thompson. It named her as his successor, the new chairwoman of the board. The document included a lengthy handwritten addendum from Harold himself. He explained his decision with heartbreaking clarity. He had discovered Marcus was embezzling from the company. He had been siphoning funds for years, creating a secret slush fund. Harold had been investigating, trying to understand the scale of it, when his health had taken its final turn. He wrote of his profound disappointment in his son, of his fear that Marcus's greed and recklessness would destroy the company he had spent his life building. "I know you will do the right thing, Ilara," the letter concluded. "You have the moral compass that my son so desperately lacks. This company is not just a source of wealth. It is a community. It provides for hundreds of families. Do not let him burn it down for his own selfish desires. The enclosed ledger will show you where to start looking." Beneath the will was a small, black ledger book. Its pages were filled with Harold's neat, precise handwriting. Dates, account numbers, transfer amounts. It was a meticulous record of Marcus's betrayal, a roadmap to his crimes, millions of dollars, funneled into offshore accounts and shell corporations. Money he had used to fund his second life, to buy the house with the picket fence, the diamond necklace, the life of a man named Marcus Jenkins. The final item in the box was a letter from Harold's personal attorney, a man named Arthur Vance, a name Elara had never heard. The letter instructed her to contact him the moment she read the will. It provided a phone number and a final, chilling instruction. Do not act until Marcus believes he has everything he has ever wanted. His arrogance will be his undoing. Let him walk into the trap himself. Standing in the funeral hall, the weight of that knowledge was a suit of armor. She had called Arthur Vance the day after she found the box. He was a kind, elderly man who had been Harold's confidant for over 40 years. He had been waiting for her call. He had confirmed everything. The will was ironclad. He had the original copy in his safe. He had been waiting for her signal. "Your father-in-law was a very wise man," Arthur had said, his voice full of respect. He knew his son was a viper. He also knew his wife, Eleanor, would enable him. The will they presented was an older version, which Harold had intentionally left accessible for them to find. He knew they would act on it, believing it to be the final one. In doing so, they have committed fraud. The plan had been set in motion. Arthur had begun the process of legally verifying the true will. He had contacted the company's board of directors, men loyal to Harold, and prepared them for the coming storm. He had advised Elara to do nothing, to say nothing, until the right moment. The funeral, he had agreed, was the perfect stage, a place of public grief, of supposed vulnerability, a place where Marcus and Eleanor would be surrounded by their peers, the very people whose opinions they valued above all else. The eulogies began. A friend of Sarah's spoke, her voice thick with tears, painting a picture of a devoted mother and a loving wife. She spoke of Sarah's husband, Mark, and his incredible devotion during her illness. Elara watched Marcus. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking. The performance was flawless. He looked every bit the grieving husband. Eleanor, beside him, placed a comforting hand on his back, her own eyes glistening with what the room would interpret as empathy. Elara knew it was pride in her son's masterful deception. Elara felt a flicker of movement in the back of the hall. A tall, silver-haired man in a dark suit had entered and was standing near the door. Arthur Vance. He caught her eye and gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. As the final eulogy concluded and the minister invited the attendees for a moment of silent reflection, a sharp, jarring noise cut through the reverent hush. A phone was ringing. It was Marcus's phone, his personal phone, the one for his life as Marcus Thompson. He fumbled in his pocket, his face a mask of irritation and embarrassment. He shot a quick, apologetic glance at the minister and silenced the call, his cheeks flushing. But the spell of solemnity was broken. Whispers rippled through the hall. How disrespectful. Who would call during a funeral? Elara knew exactly who was calling. It was part of the plan. Arthur had arranged for the bank that held the mortgage on Marcus's secret house, the house he had bought as Marcus Jenkins, to call at that precise moment. The mortgage was in severe arrears. The payments, which had been funded by his embezzling, had stopped abruptly when Harold died, and the initial flow of easy money had been complicated by the estate proceedings. The bank was calling to inform him of foreclosure. A second later, his phone buzzed again. A text message, then another, and another. A cascade of notifications. Arthur had orchestrated a full financial assault. His creditors, his offshore bankers, the managers of his shell corporations, all had been alerted by proxies that the game was up. His carefully constructed house of cards was beginning to tremble. Marcus's face had gone from flushed to pale. He stared at his phone, his eyes wide with confusion and panic. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the room, searching for an explanation. His eyes met Ilara's. For the first time, he saw not a grieving, supportive wife. He saw a stranger, a woman with eyes as cold and hard as granite. In that moment, he knew. He didn't know how, but he knew she was the source of this. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper, the performance of the grieving husband vanishing in an instant. Ilara didn't answer. She simply turned her head and looked toward the back of the hall. As if on cue, Arthur Vance began to walk down the central aisle. He was not alone. He was flanked by two other men in dark suits, members of the Thompson Manufacturing Board of Directors. Behind them were two uniformed police officers. The whispers in the hall grew louder. People were turning in their pews, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The minister, flustered, stepped forward. "Excuse me, sir, this is a private service." Arthur Vance did not stop. He walked with a calm, deliberate authority that commanded the space. He stopped directly in front of the pew where Ilara, Marcus, and Eleanor were sitting. He looked not at Marcus, but at Ilara. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice clear and steady, ringing through the now silent hall. "Are you ready to proceed?" Ilara stood up. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her. The pity was gone, replaced by stunned curiosity. She looked at Marcus, at his pale, panicked face. She looked at Eleanor, whose perfectly made-up face was a mask of haughty confusion. "Yes, Arthur," Ilara said, her own voice surprisingly strong. "I am." Eleanor rose to her feet, her back ramrod straight. "Who is this man? Marcus, what is the meaning of this intrusion? This is a funeral, for heaven's sake. Have these people removed at once." She spoke with the ingrained arrogance of a woman who had never been told no in her life. Arthur Vance turned his cool gaze upon her. "My name is Arthur Vance. I was Harold Thompson's personal attorney and the executor of his final estate." A gasp went through the room. Eleanor's face tightened. "That's impossible. Our family lawyer is Mr. Chadwick." "Mr. Chadwick was the family's corporate lawyer," Arthur corrected gently. "I handled Harold's private affairs, and I am here today to execute the terms of his true last will and testament. A document you and your son have deliberately ignored in favor of a fraudulent, outdated version." The word fraudulent hung in the air like a toxin. Marcus finally found his voice. It was shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "This is insane! My father left everything to me. I am the CEO of Thompson Manufacturing. This man is a liar! Security! Get him out of here!" But no security came. The only figures of authority were the two police officers who now stood impassively at the end of the aisle. Arthur Vance held up a hand. "That will no longer be necessary, Marcus." He produced a thick envelope from his breast pocket. "This document, the true will of Harold Thompson, was legally filed with the probate court this morning. It supersedes the fraudulent document you submitted, and it paints a very different picture of your father's final wishes." He looked around the hall, at the sea of bewildered faces. Harold Thompson was a man of immense integrity. He was also a man who knew his own son. He knew of your greed, Marcus. He knew you'd been embezzling from his company for years. Eleanor let out a strangled cry. "Lies! Slander! My son would never—" "Oh, but he would," Arthur continued, his voice relentless. "He funneled millions of dollars into a web of offshore accounts to fund a secret life. A life that included a second family, under a false name." He gestured with his head toward the casket. "A life with the late Sarah Jenkins." The sound that filled the hall was a collective, sharp intake of breath. The truth, so stark and so brutal, landed with the force of a physical blow. All eyes swiveled from Arthur to Marcus, and then to the casket, and finally to Ilara. The story suddenly, horribly, made sense. In the back of the hall, Sarah's family and friends were looking on in horror and disbelief. A woman who Ilara recognized from a photo as Sarah's sister stood up, her face pale. What did he say? Marcus Jenkins? Who is Harold Thompson? Marcus was cornered. His face was slick with sweat. It's not true. None of it. She's behind this. He pointed a trembling finger at Ilara. She's a manipulative, vindictive woman. She's trying to destroy me. Ilara met his desperate, hateful gaze without flinching. For the first time in 20 years, she felt no fear of him, no need for his approval. She felt nothing but a cold, clean pity for the pathetic creature he was. The truth is not a manipulation, Marcus, she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the dead silence. It's just the truth. Arthur Vance chose that moment to deliver the final killing blow. He opened the envelope and read from the will. His voice was dispassionate, the voice of pure, unassailable fact. I, Harold Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I bequeath my entire controlling stake of 51% of the shares of Thompson Manufacturing, along with the appointed position of chairwoman of the board, to my beloved daughter-in-law, Ilara Thompson. A wave of shock rolled through the room. It was so audacious, so unexpected, that for a moment no one could even process it. Eleanor was the first to react. She let out a laugh, a high, brittle sound on the edge of hysteria. That's preposterous! She is nothing, a nobody from the gutter. My husband would never leave his legacy in the hands of a simple, uneducated woman like her. You can't polish a stone from the gutter? It was the phrase she had used for 20 years. Behind Ilara's back, at family gatherings, whispered to her society friends. It was her favorite insult, the summation of everything she thought of Ilara. Ilara looked at the woman who had tormented her with 1,000 tiny cuts for 2 decades. The woman who had enabled her son's monstrous behavior, who had valued status and money above all else. You're right, Eleanor, Ilara said, her voice soft. You can't polish a stone. She paused, letting the silence stretch. But Harold always knew. I was never a stone. I was a diamond. And you were all just too blind to see it. Arthur Vance cleared his throat. The will is legally binding and has been authenticated. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Mrs. Thompson is the majority shareholder and acting CEO of Thompson Manufacturing. Her first official act, he said, looking directly at Marcus, was to authorize a full forensic audit of the company's finances based on a ledger kept by your father. He gestured to the 2 police officers, who now began to move forward. And her second act was to turn over evidence of grand larceny, embezzlement, and wire fraud to the district attorney's office. The officers reached their pew. One of them spoke, his voice polite but firm. Marcus Thompson, you are under arrest for the aforementioned crimes. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back. Chaos erupted. Eleanor shrieked, a raw animal sound of disbelief and fury. She lunged toward Ilara, her perfectly manicured nails clawing for her face. You did this! You witch! You destroyed my son! One of the board members, a large man named George, who had been one of Harold's oldest friends, stepped between them, blocking Eleanor's path. That's enough, Eleanor! It's over! Marcus didn't fight. All the arrogance, all the swagger had drained out of him. He looked like a deflated balloon. He stood numbly as the officer cuffed his hands behind his back. His eyes were locked on Ilara, his expression a toxic cocktail of hatred and utter bewilderment. He still couldn't understand how the woman he had dismissed as a simple, compliant accessory had so completely and utterly dismantled his entire world. As the officers led him away, past the stunned faces of his business associates and the horrified faces of Sarah's family, he looked pathetic, small. The great Marcus Thompson, the master of two universes, was just a common thief in a well-tailored suit. The hall was a cacophony of noise. People were shouting, crying. Sarah's sister was being comforted by her family, her face a mask of agony as she processed the dual trauma of her sister's death and this catastrophic betrayal. The minister was trying in vain to restore order. Ilara stood in the eye of the storm, perfectly still. She watched them lead Marcus out of the hall and into the bright, unforgiving sunlight. She felt no triumph, no joy, just a profound, quiet sense of release. The heavy weight she had been carrying for 20 years, the weight of trying to be good enough, of trying to earn the love of a man who was incapable of it, had finally been lifted. Eleanor had collapsed into the pew, her body racked with dry, racking sobs. Her perfect world, built on a foundation of money and lies, had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. Her son was going to prison. Her family name was in ruins, and the company, the source of all her status and power, now belonged to the woman she had despised most in the world. Arthur Vance came to Ilara's side. "It is done," he said quietly. "Harold would be proud." Ilara nodded, unable to speak. She looked at the polished oak casket at the front of the hall, a silent testament to a life destroyed by one man's selfishness. She thought of the two children who were now, for all intents and purposes, orphans. Their mother was gone, and the man they knew as their father was a fraud and a criminal. A new resolve began to form in the quiet space where her anger had been. It was not enough to simply punish Marcus. She had to honor Harold's legacy. She had to protect the community he had built, and she had to do something for the innocent victims of this tragedy. She turned to Arthur. "The children," she said, her voice low. "Sarah's children. What will happen to them?" "Their aunt, Sarah's sister, will likely take them in," Arthur replied. "But they have been left with nothing. Marcus drained Sarah's accounts to pay for her medical care, and his own assets are all frozen or fraudulent." "No," Ilara said, her voice firm. "They will not be left with nothing." She looked at Arthur, her eyes clear and determined. "My first act as chairwoman was to expose Marcus. My second was to authorize the audit. My third act will be to create a trust for the education and welfare of Sarah Jenkins's children. It will be funded personally by me, anonymously. They have been through enough. They don't need the Thompson name attached to their future." Arthur Vance looked at her, and for the first time, the professional mask slipped. His eyes shone with genuine admiration. "Your father-in-law was right about you, Ilara. He was absolutely right." Ilara took one last look around the chaotic hall, at the wreckage of two families, of 100 lives touched by Marcus's lies. She had not asked for this fight, but it had come to her, and she had finished it. She turned and walked away from the noise, away from the ruin, away from the life that had been a cage. She walked out into the sunlight, not as a victim, not as a grieving widow, but as the chairwoman, as herself. Finally and completely herself. The days that followed were a blur of activity. The story exploded in the local news, and then, fanned by the flames of social media, went national. CEO arrested at secret wife's funeral. The headlines screamed. The sordid details of Marcus's double life were laid bare for the world to see. The public humiliation was absolute. The Thompson name, once a symbol of industry and success, was now synonymous with scandal and deceit. Ilara, however, was insulated from the worst of it. She threw herself into her new role with a focus and energy that stunned the board of directors. They had expected a figurehead, a woman overwhelmed by circumstance who they would have to guide. They found a leader. She spent 18 hours a day at the company headquarters, a place she had only ever visited for Christmas parties. She didn't move into the opulent CEO's office that had been Marcus's. Instead, she took over Harold's old office, a smaller, more modest space with a view of the factory floor. It was cluttered with his books and schematics, and it felt like coming home. With Arthur Vance and the forensic accountants at her side, she delved into the company's books. The scale of Marcus's fraud was even worse than Harold had suspected. He had been using the company as his personal piggy bank, leveraging assets for risky personal investments, all of which had failed, and cooking the books to hide the losses. The company was teetering on the edge of insolvency. Her first board meeting as chairwoman was tense. The room was filled with grim-faced men in expensive suits, many of whom had been friends with Marcus. They looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and apprehension. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She stood at the head of the long mahogany table, Harold's ledger open in front of her. "Good morning, gentlemen," she began, her voice steady. "As you know, Thompson Manufacturing is in a precarious position. My husband's activities have left us with a debt of nearly $50 million and a credibility crisis that threatens to destroy us." A murmur went through the room. One of the board members, a man named Henderson, who had been Marcus's closest ally, spoke up. "With all due respect, Ilara, Mrs. Thompson, you have no experience in this industry. Perhaps the most prudent course of action would be to appoint an interim CEO while we explore a sale of the company." It was the challenge she had been expecting, the assumption that she was out of her depth, the dismissal. She met his gaze. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Henderson. It's true, I don't have a business degree. I haven't spent my life in boardrooms." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "I spent my life with the man who built this company. I spent the last 6 months of his life listening to him, not just about his regrets concerning his son, but about his vision for this company, a vision Marcus ignored." She gestured to the ledger. "Harold didn't just leave me a record of his son's crimes. He left me his plans. Notes on efficiency improvements he wanted to implement. Designs for a new product line he believed would revolutionize the industry. A strategy to reinvest in our workforce instead of gutting it for short-term profit." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each man. "You see this company as a collection of assets to be liquidated. Harold saw it as a family, a community. He knew every man and woman on that factory floor by name. When was the last time any of you walked the floor?" Silence. "I will not be selling this company," she stated, her voice ringing with an authority that left no room for argument. "I will not be appointing an interim CEO. I am the CEO, and we are going to save this company. Harold's way." She then proceeded to lay out a detailed 3-point plan for recovery. It was brilliant. It was audacious. It was pure Harold Thompson. It involved restructuring the debt, cutting executive bonuses and salaries, starting with her own, and investing heavily in research and development and employee training. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The suspicion had been replaced by a grudging respect, and in some, a flicker of genuine hope. George, Harold's old friend, was the first to speak. It's what Harold would have wanted, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm with you, Ilara. 100%. One by one, the other board members voiced their support. Even Henderson, seeing the tide turn, reluctantly agreed to the plan. Ilara had won her first battle. The weeks turned into months. The work was grueling. She faced resistance at every turn. Banks were skeptical. Suppliers were nervous. The employees, hearing rumors of bankruptcy, were scared for their jobs. Ilara met with them all. She held town hall meetings in the factory cafeteria, standing on a plastic chair so everyone could see her. She was honest with them. She laid out the stark reality of their situation. She told them about Marcus's betrayal, not to gossip, but to explain how they had gotten here. And then she laid out her plan to fix it. She promised them that there would be no layoffs. She promised them that their pensions, which Marcus had tried to raid, were safe. She promised them that if they stood with her, they would not only survive, they would thrive. Harold Thompson built this company on a foundation of quality and integrity, she told the assembled workers, her voice echoing in the vast space. We have strayed from that path. It's time to find our way back. I can't do it alone. I need you. All of you. It was a turning point. The workers, who had been bracing for the worst, began to believe in her. They saw Harold in her words, in her determination. They saw a leader who was fighting for them, not for a golden parachute. They started working harder, smarter. The factory floor, which had been filled with an air of despair, began to hum with a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, the legal process against Marcus ground on. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic audit uncovered a staggering level of corruption. He had not only funded his second life, but also a gambling addiction and a series of disastrously bad investments. He had been just months away from bankrupting the company entirely. Faced with an ironclad case, Marcus took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for fraud and embezzlement. Ilara did not attend the sentencing. She was too busy saving the company he had tried to destroy. Eleanor was a ghost. Socially ostracized, her friends abandoning her overnight, she was forced to sell her lavish mansion to pay for Marcus's legal fees and to cover her own complicity in the initial will fraud, a charge the DA had agreed to drop in exchange for her full cooperation. She ended up in a small, sterile condominium, a world away from the opulent life she had always known. Ilara heard from Chloe that she spent her days in a bitter, lonely silence, a prisoner of her own pride and regret. Ilara made good on her promise to Sarah's children. The trust was established, managed by Arthur Vance, its source a carefully guarded secret. Their aunt, a kind and stable woman, was able to buy a larger house and provide them with everything they needed. Their future was secure. It was a small act of justice in a world that had been so unjust to them. A year passed. It was a year of relentless work, of small victories and terrifying setbacks. But slowly, painstakingly, Ilara turned the company around. The new product line, based on Harold's final designs, was a runaway success. Profits began to climb. The company's stock, which had plummeted after the scandal, began to recover and then to soar. Thompson Manufacturing was saved. More than that, it was transformed. It was more efficient, more innovative, and more profitable than it had ever been under Marcus. Ilara had not just protected Harold's legacy, she had enhanced it. One crisp autumn afternoon, a year and a half after the funeral, Ilara was walking the factory floor. It was something she did every day. The noise of the machinery, the smell of oil and metal, the sight of people working with purpose, it grounded her. The workers no longer looked at her with apprehension. They smiled. They waved. They called her by her first name. George, the board member, fell into step beside her. "You've done it, Elara," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You actually did it." "Harold would be so damn proud." Elara smiled, a genuine tired smile. "We did it, George, all of us." As they walked, a man from the R&D department ran up to them, his face alight with excitement. He was holding a prototype of a new component. "Elara, you have to see this. We've had a breakthrough. This is going to change everything." She took the small, intricate piece of metal in her hand, her eyes lighting up as he explained the innovation. In that moment, she was not a grieving widow or a scorned wife. She was not the woman who had been underestimated and dismissed. She was a creator, a builder, a leader. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. That evening, for the first time in a long time, she left the office at a reasonable hour. She drove not to the large, empty house she had once shared with Marcus, a house she had sold months ago, but to a small, charming apartment she had taken in the city, overlooking a park. As she walked in, the aroma of garlic and herbs filled the air. A man with kind eyes and a warm smile looked up from the stove. "Hey, you're home early." His name was Daniel. He was an architect she had met 6 months ago when she'd commissioned a new childcare facility for the company's employees. He was quiet, brilliant, and funny. He looked at her not with pity or awe, but with a simple, uncomplicated affection that felt more real than anything she had ever known. He knew her story, all of it, and he didn't care about the Thompson name or the money. He cared about her. "The team had a breakthrough," she said, dropping her keys and briefcase on the table. "A big one." "I knew you would," he said, stirring the sauce. "You always do." He came over and wrapped his arms around her, holding her in a way that felt safe and steady. "How does the most powerful CEO in the tri-state area feel about pasta for dinner?" She laughed, a real unburdened laugh. She leaned her head against his chest and closed her eyes, inhaling the scent of home. The ghosts of the past were finally quiet. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep and abiding peace. She thought of Eleanor's cruel words, the ones that had been the soundtrack to her old life. "You can't polish a stone from the gutter." She had been wrong. But Elara had been wrong too. She hadn't been a diamond in the rough. A diamond is just a stone, valued for its rarity and its ability to be cut and polished by others. That was never her. Harold had seen it. She was not a stone to be polished or a diamond to be owned. She was the mountain. Solid, unmovable, weathering every storm, and in the end, still standing, reaching for the sky. She had the strength inside her all along. She just needed to be pushed hard enough to finally discover it. Later that night, as she sat with Daniel on the balcony, a glass of wine in her hand, looking out at the glittering city lights, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Not for the pain she had endured, but for the strength it had forged. The life she was living now was not one she had ever imagined, but it was real. It was hers. And it was built not on lies or inheritance, but on the solid bedrock of her own resilience, her own integrity, her own worth. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that you can't build a life on the hollow ground of someone else's approval. True power isn't about the money you have or the name you carry. It's about knowing, deep in your soul, that you are enough. It's about having the courage to walk away from anyone who makes you feel you are not. The world had tried to tell her she was nothing. It had tried to break her. But in the end, she was not broken. She was free, and she was living the life she truly deserved. Woo.